How's it going, you guys? So in this video I want to talk about resting heart rate variability, how to use a heart rate and calorie and activity tracker in order to assess your overall stress load on the body, whether or not you're recovering, you're overtraining, you're training too hard, or maybe you're not training enough, and resting heart rate variability, and all things related to this subject. So at a baseline, I strongly advise anyone and everybody to get themselves some type of heart rate monitor, preferably one they can wear on their wrist. All different heart rate monitors, they measure and calculate your recovery and your heart rate and your calorie expenditure and all these things with a variety of different equations and mathematical methods. Okay, so a lot of them, they're going to have different results. I personally, I'm still kind of undecided because right now I'm on my first 30 days of a Whoop free trial, and I'm comparing it to my Fitbit data, and I would expect the Whoop to be way more advanced, but I find the Fitbit actually seems to be much more accurate on my caloric expenditure and my heart rate throughout the day. Not to mention the Whoop doesn't give me a real-time assessment of my heart rate throughout the day. It only measures it during activity and sleep on my app. Whereas my Fitbit, I can see my heart rate trend all throughout the day at various points in time. So, heart rate variability. So let's start with resting heart rate. So what is resting heart rate? Resting heart rate is basically a measure of your heart rate at rest. It measures it in your most relaxing point of sleep, generally speaking. Depending on what tracker is being used, a lot of people measure their heart rate first thing in the morning to get a resting heart rate measure. Generally speaking, a so-called healthy resting heart rate depends on your age, but is generally agreed to be between 60 and 100 beats per minute. If you're more physically active, or if you're much younger, and under the age of 20, generally speaking, 40 to 70 would be the ideal range. And from what I've seen, comparing different athletes and different studies and meta-analysis that's measuring heart rate and comparing it to overall mortality and especially cardiovascular risk, I believe that probably the ideal range to put your heart rate into. So if we're being more modest, your resting heart rate should be anywhere from between 40 and 70 beats per minute if we're talking overall health and longevity. But if we're talking overall cardiovascular efficiency and just a metric to aim for as far as overall heart rate efficiency, I would say 40 to 60 beats per minute, with, I would say, around 50 to 55 beats per minute is probably an ideal metric to aim for. And you can get yourself there by obviously removing all the junk food and all this stuff, the sugar and yada yada, and then getting down to a healthy body weight and doing high intensity interval training and more high intensity cardiovascular activity on a regular basis with adequate recovery is probably a good place to go for that goal. So, what about heart rate variability? So heart rate variability is a measure of variability in between beats. Okay, so generally speaking, your heart rate, it might be 60 beats per minute, but there's a large variability of time in between beats throughout the day and throughout different time periods of heartbeat. And so a greater variability in heart rate, a greater heart rate variability is generally agreed to be a measure of effective physiological stress recovery. Okay, heart rate variability is a direct measure of how much stress the nervous system is under at a given point in time. Okay, so lower heart rate variability is a sign of extreme stress, and so higher heart rate variability is less stress, generally speaking. So when you're exercising and you do a really hardcore, intense workout, generally speaking, your heart rate variability that night is going to go down, and your resting heart rate is probably going to go up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just a sign that your nervous system is under stress. Okay? But what you want to look for is just like with the resting heart rate, you want to look for a trend over a period of time. So if you have 5 days in a row where your heart rate variability is going down, and as pretty much your resting heart rate is going to go up at the same time, that's a sign that you're under a lot of stress, and you should probably take a couple days off. And if you keep seeing a trend like that, worsening scores in your resting heart rate, your heart rate variability, and they're not recovering back to a baseline or going back down in that trend towards the baseline, then what's going to happen is, then basically that's what people would call physiological overtraining. Okay, that's just a sign that your body's under increasing periods of stress and it's not recovering, or it's not experiencing any relief. And so these two metrics are extremely important. If you're not measuring one, measure the other. They both pretty much indicate the same thing, just too much stress, not enough recovery. And they both will increase or decrease pretty much at the same time. Like if you have a higher heart rate variability, you're going to have a lower resting heart rate, which indicates less physiological stress, and then vice versa. They're both going to change in response to the same things: sickness, illness, increased training loads, things like that. So, I don't really feel like it's important. Like if you have a Fitbit, for example, it doesn't measure heart rate variability, but it measures sleep, it measures caloric expenditure, it measures resting heart rate. If you have a Whoop, it'll measure all of that, the Fitbit does, but also it'll measure heart rate variability. But, it's not really important to care that much about heart rate variability if you're already measuring resting heart rate, in my opinion. Just because they both increase or decrease, they both change in response to the same things at the same time. Not always, but most of the time. So anyway, when it comes to this overtraining syndrome, a lot of people, they just base it on guesswork and how they're feeling subjectively. Like if they're feeling tired all the time and maybe they don't have the best sleep or whatever, then they automatically assume they're overtraining or what have you, or that they have too much cortisol, or they self-diagnose without an objective measure. I can't begin to explain how many people claim that they have chronic fatigue syndrome or something like that. They haven't actually had a cortisol saliva test. Cortisol to testosterone ratio has not been tested. They don't have any objective measures. Well, the great thing about having a fitness tracker, whether it's a Fitbit or the Whoop, is that you can actually directly track your stress and your baseline and your trends over time, and also track your stress in relationship to the food and the exercise protocols that you partake in. So you can directly measure these things with the fitness tracker. You don't need a doctor or anything like that, and they're relatively cheap. A Fitbit, for the purpose that you're intending, you can get the Inspire 2 for like $100, and it measures everything. It's waterproof. The only thing it doesn't have compared to the higher ones is like music features and like GPS system and crap like that. You don't really need that. All you need is the heart rate monitor and yada yada. The Whoop is $30 a month, but for me, I got a free month trial. I'm probably going to return it, just because I don't feel like it's much better than the Fitbit that I already have. Where was I going with this? So, if you think you have some kind of stress-related syndrome, overtraining syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, whatever it may be, get a fitness tracker. Okay, if you actually really do have clinical overtraining syndrome or something related to cortisol to testosterone ratio, things like that, obviously a blood test would be way better, but you could easily just track your resting heart rate. If your resting heart rate is over 70 beats per minute, that's either a sign of chronic stress or just under adaptation to stress. So generally speaking, people who do not exercise, who are generally sedentary, their heart rate is in between 70 and 100 beats per minute. You know, and if you've never really been a competitive athlete or anything like that, or if you have not done vigorous activity in over 2 years, and your resting heart rate is over 70, chances are your problem is not overtraining syndrome. Chances are your problem is that you need more exercise, and it's probably something else like electrolyte imbalances. You're probably eating a food that you're intolerant to, or maybe you have some kind of mental imbalances. Now, if your resting heart rate is over 100 beats per minute, now that's a sign of a serious problem. Generally speaking, you know, I would even say, I would say a resting heart rate of over 80 beats per minute is a sign of a health problem, in my opinion. That's a pretty high resting heart rate, and it shouldn't be that much unless you have a cardiovascular issue, maybe if you have a stress-related issue, overtraining syndrome, or if you are severely sick or ill, or if you're dramatically overweight. I'm talking, you know, 150 pounds overweight or more, then your resting heart rate is going to be well over 85 beats per minute, generally speaking. So anyway, resting heart rate is 100% excellent for measuring your body's response to stress. So if you're already training and you are scared of overtraining, the way that you would figure it out is you would establish your baseline. So you'd basically maybe take a whole week of rest, right? A 7-day rest period, where when you first get your Fitbit or your Whoop or whatever it is, for one whole week, don't exercise at all. And then you'll probably see your resting heart rate will go down. It'll go down, it'll go down, and then it'll stabilize. When it stabilizes, I think right now my resting heart rate after a couple days of rest stabilizes around 55 beats per minute, because I don't really do as much cardio as I was when I was competing for kickboxing and whatnot. So 55 is probably not that bad, actually. But I'm still assessing that. So you get your baseline at rest after about a week of rest, and then you just do some vigorous training, and you do your normal vigorous training routine and watch your resting heart rate's response to that. Now, the more and the better that you sleep, generally, the better your heart rate tracking is going to be. So heart rate variability and resting heart rate, it's going to be a lot more accurate if you get your 6 to 8 hours of sleep that you normally do, your normal sleep. If your sleep patterns start changing, the accuracy and or just the overall score is probably going to suffer, but that's not always true. So if you notice a severe spike in your resting heart rate multiple days in a row, you just see it trending in the overstressed direction after a number of days, especially after, I would say, about 4 days in a row, it's just going up and it's going up and it's going up and it's not stabilizing and it's not going down and up, then that's a sign that you probably need a rest day. Now, 4 days is probably not even enough to really be too worried, depending on how big the spike is. If your resting heart rate goes up and stays up any more than like 5 beats per minute over baseline for 7 days in a row, yeah, that's probably an indication that you're either overstressed or you're in illness, okay? And probably baseline isn't even necessarily one you should measure. So you should establish a baseline at rest and a baseline that seems to be the average of your harder training days. So for example, during rest, like I said, I'd be around 55 beats per minute on average for a full 7-day rest week. But then in heavy periods of training, I'm around 66 beats per minute pretty consistently. Now, 66 beats per minute is about my average when under extreme training stress. Now, if that average during a heavy training week goes from 66 beats per minute, in the average of 7 days, and then it trends upward to 77 beats per minute, now I'm pushing overtraining most likely. I mean, that's a dramatic increase, not only from my baseline level of recovery, but from my baseline during a heavy, stressful training week. So, and I'm talking resting heart rate, not heart rate variability. That would be a lower lower heart rate variability would be the equivalent of a higher resting heart rate, meaning a negative stress response, basically. So, again, I think heart rate variability and resting heart rate, you could do either or you could track them both. A Whoop will track them both, but I don't know, I'm starting to question the accuracy of the Whoop based on the metrics that I've seen so far. But I think resting heart rate's just fine, and it's been used for decades now as a golden standard. And I just think, for one, you can generally see how you feel. I've actually noticed during my rest weeks, I feel like trash. I feel way worse during my rest days and my rest weeks, even though I see my markers of recovery go up. Like, I'm sore as crap, and I'm feeling stiff, and I'm feeling lethargic, but my resting heart rate is drastically improving, whereas my heart rate variability is improving at the same time. So objectively, on paper, using these metrics, my recovery is getting better, but yet I feel like trash because, well, I'm not moving, I'm not, doing my normal athletic activities. So that's just one example of why you should be using objective markers for physiological stress and adaptation and recovery, because your feelings will lie to you. And of course, the even more interesting is that, there's going to be different levels of performance while under stress depending on the activity. So if you're doing heavy cardiovascular activity, if you're doing things like jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, like me, or you're a marathon runner or even a sprinter, you're going to find that your performance is probably going to decrease in relation to your resting heart rate, or in relation to your heart rate variability. But with things like strength training, I've personally found that you can continue to increase your strength gains. Like, your performance can actually increase on strength training, on squats and bench press specifically, not necessarily deadlifts. But your stress, you can continue to make strength gains even when your heart rate, your resting heart rate is going up, your heart rate variability is going down. You're going to find, there's actually been studies where they show lifters who are training Bulgarian, training to a max squat every single day, after about 8 weeks, their cortisol to testosterone ratio is dramatically fucked, basically. They have extremely high cortisol and extremely low testosterone, but they're still hitting PRs, like all-time PRs on their squat, despite the horrible hormones. So what that shows you is that, the physiological stress in which you're under is not necessarily going to dictate your performance that day, especially in regards to strength. But like I said before, things like marathon running and MMA and jiu-jitsu, obviously jiu-jitsu and MMA has not really been studied as much as marathon running. But marathon running especially, is what the overtraining model is based on. What all of this recovery, adaptation, the general adaptation syndrome and things like that is actually based on is marathon running and endurance athletes. Now that's scientifically validated. Performance will go down in those sports in relation to your physiological markers of stress. But when it comes to strength training, that's actually not true at all. You could be under a lot of stress, your testosterone levels can go to shit, and you could still make gains. Jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, MMA, probably not. It's probably going to be a lot more in alignment with the endurance performance going to shit. Basically, your performance is going to go to shit in those sports, most likely. But it has not been studied. It's not going to be in alignment with strength performance going up compared to the amount of stress type of model that I was talking about. So in conclusion, I think it's very important to measure your resting heart rate, measure your heart rate variability, measure your sleep, and also your energy expenditure. And actually, I gotta talk a little bit about that before I conclude the video. So that's another thing, is that, you know, your resting heart rate and your heart rate variability, you know, maybe sometimes the measures will be inaccurate, right? Which of course, recording trends over time will help to, you know, get an accurate representation of your stress levels, regardless of how accurate a couple nights actually are or are not. But your caloric expenditure, the amount of energy that you expend every single day, especially compared to the amount of energy in which you consume, is also going to help you get an accurate, you know, logical perspective on this. So what I mean is, let's say that your resting heart rate is going up, which indicates high physiological stress. And it's going up for days and days. And you know you're under a serious, like, training block. You also feel like crap. You feel sore as hell, your legs feel heavy. Maybe you feel more stressed, you feel more anxious than normal. You're having a harder time sleep. So your mood is to shit, your sleep is to shit, your body is feeling like shit. Your resting heart rate's been going up. Already you should have a logical idea that, well, I'm probably pushing it a little too hard and I should take some days off and do some active recovery especially. Well, you also have your caloric expenditure, how much energy you've been expending this week. And you can compare your caloric expenditure this week compared to a previous successful training block where you didn't push overtraining, right? And you can measure, well, how much energy was I expending over a 4-week period before I took a rest day. And what you're doing is you're looking at basically the intensity of stress, the intensity of training in which your body was under during that 4-week period previously. You can compare it to this 4-week period where you feel like you're overtraining. All the objective measures of heart rate says you're overtraining. Body feels like you're overtraining. And you can look at, well, damn, I burned 20,000 extra calories during this 4-week period compared to that last 4-week period where I successfully went hard, had a week of rest and recovery, and then adapted to it. So now you have an objective measure of how hard you're training in this block compared to the last one. Is how much calories you're expending on a regular basis, and then your heart rate response in response to that, your sleep response in response to that. And if you're really serious about this, you know, and you're not dumb, you're keeping some kind of training log, some kind of daily log where you track your mood each day, you track your food every day, you track, you know, how you're feeling, how you're thinking, and a little diary so you have extra information, you know, and you also track the activities you do for recovery. Like I did, you know, an hour of stretching, an hour of foam rolling. So now you have all the objective data you need to really figure out whether you're overtraining or not. Because just going by feel is not necessarily going to cut it. Because you can be 100% recovered and feel like crap. Just because you're not doing the stretching, you're not doing the active recovery that you should be doing, but your body's not under any stress. The more you move, generally the better you'll feel, unless it's extremely intense on a regular basis. Then it's gonna be the opposite. So anyway, in conclusion, measure your resting heart rate at least. Measure your energy expenditure as well. And then if you really wanna go the extra mile, get a Whoop, measure your respiratory rate, measure your heart rate variability. And, you know, if you, for whatever reason, think that, you know, you're still doing, chronic fatigue syndrome, overtraining syndrome, high cortisol, even though the Whoop and everything says otherwise, then that is what I would call nirvana of health syndrome, hypochondria. That's hypochondria. Okay? If you're fully recovered according to these trackers, but you feel like crap, then it's not the stress you're under that's the problem. It's not chronic cortisol or anything like that. It's something else. Probably a food intolerance, probably a mineral imbalance, vitamin or mineral deficiency, or an overload of something. Maybe it's your breathing or something, who knows? But it's not your stress response, and that's very important. Okay? There's not a whole lot of like objective facts when it comes to science and health and nutrition. You have to use clues, you have to do trial and error, experimentation, and use data to help guide you towards new experiments to figure out what it is. Okay? These aren't giving you objective facts about what's happening, but they're giving you clues as to what's happening. Okay? And there could be a million different reasons why you feel like crap or why you feel tired, It's good, and so it's important to X out all of the things that are not the problem, so you can get closer to what is the problem. Leave your question in the comments down below. Measure, track, log. Stop guessing. Stop being a rat on a spinning wheel. I'll talk to y'all next time.